Hey everyone, welcome to week 10 of ENS 5520. This week we shift our focus to the final stage of the BehavioX method, evaluation. Up to this point, you've done a significant amount of work. You've defined your problem, you've mapped your system, you've gathered and appraised evidence, you've identified and prioritized a target behavior, you've conducted a behavioral diagnosis, and you've designed an intervention. Now we arrive at the final question. Did it actually work? Evaluation is how we answer this. It allows us to determine whether our interventions had any impact, not only on behavior, but also on the broader problem that we set out to address. Evaluation is often treated as an afterthought, but in behavioral science, it's essential. Without evaluation, we can't confidently say whether an intervention has been effective. We also can't distinguish between real impact and changes that may have occurred for other reasons. Importantly, evaluation's not just about proving success. It's also about learning what worked, what didn't, and how can we improve future interventions. In many real-world contexts, evaluation is also about accountability. Interventions often involve public resources, and it's important to demonstrate that those resources are being used effectively. This week, we're focusing on 4 key components of good evaluation design. These are our outcomes. What impact are we trying to achieve? Our measures, how will we assess that impact? Our study design, how will we determine whether the intervention caused the impact? And sampling, who are we measuring and how? You'll see that evaluation is not a single step, but a structured process that requires careful planning. The first step in evaluation is to define what success looks like. In behavioral science, we typically think about 4 types of outcomes. The first is outcomes for our intervention. Did our audience engage in our intervention? For example, if the intervention was an education program combined with a social media campaign, we'd want to know how many people took part in the education program and how much engagement we got on social media. Understanding things like engagement, participation, and general penetration of the intervention into the target audience is critical to evaluating the overall success of the intervention itself. The second is behavioral driver outcomes. Did we influence the underlying drivers of our priority behavior, like beliefs or attitudes or opportunity or capability? This helps us understand if our intervention actually changed the relevant drivers that we identified during our behavioral diagnosis. A lot of people might have participated heavily in our intervention with really great engagement, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we successfully addressed our audience's barriers. The third is priority behavior outcomes. Did our audience actually perform our priority behavior? For example, how many people adopted the behavior that we prioritized? Did they do the behavior how we wanted them to do it? And did they do the behavior as many times as we wanted them to do it? This helps us understand if our intervention was also successfully aligned to the priority behavior. The fourth is our real-world outcomes. Did we ultimately impact the broader problem that we were trying to solve? This helps us understand if the behavior that we prioritized actually had any impact upon the problem that we initially set out to address. So for example, if the goal was to reduce unnecessary use of emergency services like 000, we might measure for our intervention how many people saw a media campaign that we delivered on emergency service use. We'd measure for our behavior whether people actually reduced their inappropriate or unnecessary calls. For drivers, we might measure whether our awareness or attitudes change in our audience. And for real-world outcomes, we'd measure whether response times for genuine emergencies improved. It's important to think across all levels and to measure as comprehensively as it is feasible. We'll talk more about this case study in class. Once we know what we want to measure, the next question is, how do we measure it? Now, there are 2 key distinctions to consider. The first is direct versus indirect measurement. Direct measures capture the outcome itself, right? They're directly measuring it. Indirect measures infer the outcome through a proxy. In most applied behavioral contexts, we aim for direct measures wherever possible. Not always the case, though. The second and most important distinction is between self-report and objective measures. Self-report measures involve asking people about their behavior or their beliefs or their attitudes, right? This could include surveys or interviews or focus groups. Objective measures involve observing a behavior or using existing objective data sources. And this could be administrative records, sensor data, behavioral observations. Each approach, self-report or observational, has its strengths and limitations. Self-report is often necessary when we're measuring internal states like feelings or attitudes. However, it's subject to biases, including recall bias, social desirability bias. Objective measures are generally more reliable for capturing behavior, but they're not always available or feasible, and they also miss out on all the internal things. In practice, strong evaluations often combine these approaches where possible. It's also important to consider the key qualities of good measurement. And these are things like validity, so are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring? And reliability of our measures. Would we get consistent results if we measured again? The next step is to determine how we will assess whether our intervention caused any observed changes. And this is where study design becomes really critical. There are 3 common types of study design that we tend to focus on. The first is a pre-post design. This involves measuring your outcomes before the intervention and then measuring again after the intervention. It's a very simple approach. It's often the most feasible, but it has a key limitation. We can't make any causal claims. We can't rule out that other factors might have caused the change that we're seeing. The second design is what's called a matched control design. This introduces what's called a comparison or a control group that doesn't receive our intervention. Again, by comparing changes over time, but now between the intervention group and the control group, we can better isolate the effect of the intervention. However, there may still be differences between the groups that influence results. The third and most rigorous of the approaches is what's called a randomized control trial, or an RCT. In an RCT, participants are randomly assigned to either the intervention group or the control group. This randomization helps ensure that our groups are comparable, and so it better allows us to attribute the differences in outcomes to the intervention itself. RCTs are often the gold standard, and they provide the strongest evidence of causal impact. However, they're not always practical or ethical in a real-world setting. So, in practice, study design often involves balancing rigor with feasibility. The final component of evaluation is sampling, and this involves deciding who are we measuring and how representative are they of our broader population. In most cases, we can't measure our entire population, so we tend to work with a smaller sample. And the goal here is to ensure that this sample is as representative of the larger population as possible. There are many different ways to sample. 2 of the most common that we see are random sampling, which is where you randomly sample from your population. This increases representativeness. The second is what's called convenient sampling. You conveniently recruit people. It's often more practical, but it does introduce bias. A stronger evaluation plan involves defining clear outcomes, selecting appropriate measures, choosing a suitable study design, and identifying a representative sample. Together, these different components allow us to assess whether our intervention had any meaningful impact. This week's content directly feeds into assignment 3. For your assignment, you'll need to outline an evaluation plan for your intervention, and you have to include these 4 things. First, your intended outcomes of your intervention, ensuring you include outcomes for your intervention, your behavioral drivers, your priority behavior, and your real-world problem. 2, your proposed measures for these outcomes. 3, your study design. And 4, your sampling approach. Importantly, you should justify your choices. Why is this evaluation approach appropriate for your specific intervention and your context? The key message from this week is that evaluation is essential to understanding whether behavior change interventions actually work. The entire process of evaluation, with all its components, allows us to draw meaningful and credible conclusions. We'll explore these ideas in more depth in this week's workshop, and I'll see you there.